Review of the Guyker 6-in-line vintage style locking machine heads or tuners. This isn't going to be my usual very detailed and long-winded review, because I was asked to do this review by a subscriber and I've already fitted the machine heads on the guitar, so that limits the amount of film footage I can take. So here we go. Anyone who watched the blind tests I did on 3 Fender Strat style guitars will remember that the Strat copy had tuning issues. And the Strat copy was a Donner DST152. And it was a really brilliant guitar sound-wise, but the tuning wasn't the best. So I decided to replace the machine heads on it. And because the guitar's relatively cheap, I thought it'd have only cheap machine heads on it. So I set myself a budget of about 30 quid to get a new set of machine heads for it. And I set about on Google looking for the best options. Eventually I found these Guyker vintage style locking machine heads on Amazon at under 25 quid. So they're what I ordered. As usual with Amazon, they came in the usual Amazon packaging, and they came pretty damn quickly. So here's what they look like coming out of the package. You can see they come in a see-through plastic box and they're mounted in cardboard. And the box is quite heavy, so I'm assuming so far that they're all metal. First impressions. Once I've got them out of the box, I can confirm they are solid metal. They seem to be made mainly of folded steel, and the chrome plating on them is really good. So I can't see anything wrong with them at this stage. They look really good and worth the money. And I have to admit that these aren't my favourite style of machine heads. I've never liked the vintage ones of any make, even the good quality ones. So given the choice, I would have bought a different style of machine head. However, I want to make sure the holes are in the same place because I don't want to ruin the look of the guitar, and that's why I've gone for these vintage style machine heads. Something that you only really notice when you put the Guyker machine heads alongside the original machine heads is that there's a very slight difference in the colour. And this doesn't bother me, but if you think this would bother you, the Guyker machine heads are very slightly more silvery, or at least they are compared with the machine heads on this particular guitar. But to me, on first inspection, they look pretty good and they look like they'll do the job just fine. I'm going to demonstrate now how these machine heads were fitted. However, if you've seen this before or you're not interested, you can skip on to the conclusion using the chapters. How to replace vintage style inline machine heads. I know I've been very specific in the title there, but the same principle works for most machine heads. And the first thing we need to do is just take the strings off the posts of the existing machine heads. And before you do this, you could actually use a capo to hold the strings in place, unless you intend to replace the strings, of course. If you can, I always recommend replacing the strings, because loosening them off and tightening them up is never good for the strings, and it does affect the tone as well as the life of the strings. Also, if you've still got strings attached to the guitar, you can quite easily scratch the finish on the guitar with the strings because they've got quite sharp ends. Once you've taken the strings off the tuning posts, you can turn over the guitar. Now you can have access to the screws, so you can remove the screws, in order to get the machine heads off. On these vintage machine heads, there's a screw between the machine heads that's kind of shared between two machine heads, and then there's a screw at either end. And you need to remove all these screws to take the machine heads off. I've speeded up the repetitive parts of the video to 3 times the normal speed, just to make it a little less boring. With these vintage style machine heads, the bushes are usually pushed into place, so you can easily push them out with the end of a screwdriver. Once I've removed 1 or 2 of the machine heads, I'll just check that the new machine heads are going to fit correctly. Because the last thing you want to do is remove all the machine heads and then find out that the new machine heads won't fit in place correctly. It's a good idea to have somewhere ready where you can keep the screws in the bushes, because you don't want to lose them. And it's also a good idea to check that they've provided everything you need to fit the new machine heads. And if they don't look wrong and if they're in good condition, you might want to use the original screws and the original bushes, and then you won't have to remove the original bushes. And the screws will be guaranteed to fit into the existing holes, because sometimes with the new machine heads you can get bigger or smaller screws, which might cause you issues. With these vintage machine heads, I find it useful to have a magnetic screwdriver, because it's quite awkward getting the screws between the machine heads without one. And I never tighten up the screws all the way the first time round. I'll fit the machine heads loosely to make sure 100% that everything's fitting correctly before I actually tighten the screws up. When fitting these vintage machine heads, they don't have to be put in any particular order except for the machine head on the right hand end and the left hand end, and you can tell which these are by the fact they've got a longer base for mounting the screw in. If you get staggered machine heads, these have to be put in a specific order. When you finally tighten up the machine heads, make sure you don't over tighten them, because you don't want to strip the hole in the guitar or damage the screw itself. Once you've fitted the machine heads and the screws are tight, you'll want to turn over the guitar and make sure the bushes are still in place, because they sometimes get pushed out whilst you're fitting the machine heads. And then once you've done this, you just need to put the strings back on and tune the guitar up. When I did this job, I also replaced the string trees, but I'll go into this in a separate video. Before you try to put the strings back on, you need to loosen off all the locking mechanisms on the machine heads, because these will block the hole in the tuning post. And that's basically what they do. So when you put the new string in, you tighten these back up and it clamps the string into place, so you don't need so many winds on the tuning post. Here you can see in high magnification what happens as you tighten the locking mechanism up. So to put the strings back on, you push the strings through the hole in the tuning post and then tighten up the locking mechanism, and then you can tune the guitar. However, I usually put at least half a wind on, or even 1 or 2 winds. And the reason for this is, if you go straight into the hole and lock it up, when you start tuning the guitar, the pressure of the string can be lying on the sharp edge of the hole, and this can cut through the string eventually. So if you want your strings to last longer, it's best to have at least half or a complete wind on. This way you spread the load of the tuned string over a larger surface area. Right, I think the tuning of the strings is part of the review process, so let's jump to the conclusion. Tests and conclusion for the Guyker inline vintage style locking machine heads. The first thing I'll check is, are these machine heads truly 15:1 ratio, which is what they're advertised as. And if you saw my previous video on machine heads, you'll know you can measure this. So let's do that now. I'm going to use the tuner for the bottom E string to do this test. And that's just because it's easier to see and it's easier to get to. So that's why I'm removing the string from this post. But remember, with the locking machine heads, you have to loosen off the locking mechanism before you can remove the string. The next thing I'll do is put something through the hole, just so I can see how far I've turned the machine head. And I'm using a bit of filament from a 3D printer for this. Next, I'll put some black tape on the machine head thumb screw, so you can see when I've done a complete turn. Finally, I'll place a bit of tape on the actual guitar, so I can see where the rotation of the tuning post begins and ends. I'll just move the guitar slightly so it lines up properly as you can see it through the camera. And here we go. I'm sure you can see why I've stuck black tape on one side of the machine head. It's very easy to lose track of half turns and turns. As you can see, I can definitely confirm that these are 15:1 ratio tuners. And I think that's about the standard for these inline vintage style tuners. Now, the tuning of the guitar from zero when I put these on was pretty good. It does get the guitar in tune. However, is it an improvement on what was existing on the guitar before this job? And sadly to say, no, it's no improvement at all. And whilst they do work, they look quite well made, and the locking mechanism works really nicely. However, the gearing, or the machining with the gearing, is really poor, because I can move the machine heads like a quarter of a turn down and up before it actually has any effect on the string whatsoever. And this is because of loose gearing. It's not really well made. So would I recommend these? Not really. Apart from the locking mechanism, there's no real improvement on the original machine heads, because this was the problem with the original machine heads. And maybe this might be a slight problem with all vintage style machine heads, and this is probably why I don't like them. But it does make it more awkward to tune your guitar accurately, and it takes a little bit longer. Also, if you allow the thumb screw to sit in the neutral point where it's not biting against the gearing, it can be quite loose, and therefore it will create vibrations, especially if you've got the amp up loud, and this would create negative resonance, which would kill the tone of your guitar. The conclusion. Aesthetically, they look really good. The chrome's uniform, and it looks really nice, and everything looks like it's really solidly built. And when you fit them on the guitar, all the holes are in the right place, and everything's the right size. The locking mechanism works well, and is really effective. And the tuners are a genuine 15:1 ratio. However, all this being said, the gearing is really sloppy. So you can have up to a quarter of a turn before anything happens with the tuning of the guitar. and this can make it really difficult to fine-tune the instrument. Also, this gives the potential for rattles in the future as they bed in properly. So this is a really bad point, sadly. Now, I still need a decent set of machine heads for this guitar, and I want to make sure that they're vintage style machine heads because I don't want any exposed holes. So I'll be taking a look what's available out there, and when I get another set, I'll obviously review those. So if you're not subscribed already, and if you'd like to see that review, please like, subscribe and hit the bell icon, and then you'll be notified when I upload it. Also, it's worth me pointing out, this channel is more about guitar tutorials. So if you'd like to improve your guitar playing or learn some new techniques, do please follow the channel. And you can also find plenty of tutorials at www.ebooks4guitar.com, and there you'll find lots of short courses where I've put the videos in order so that you can follow the courses through and improve your technique in a progressive form. So even if you feel you've reached the peak of your own capabilities, you can actually improve just by doing things progressively. And this is why, rather than just producing individual guitar lessons, I write short and long courses. Anyhow, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you visit the channel again soon.